The House of Lords, should we abolish it? Some of you would have already seen the video that I put out last week about the House of Lords. Effectively, I got the chance, well, made the chance happen, I guess, to go up to London and go into the House of Lords, which you can see the Houses of Parliament behind me here in this video. The House of Lords is this end, and speak to 4 members of the House. Baroness Brown here. Who else did we speak to? Baroness Smith. Oh, where's he gone? The Earl of Devon. Lord Norton's in here somewhere as well. We spoke to a bunch of members of the House of Lords to kind of try and get a grasp on what does the unelected upper chamber of the UK's Parliament do, and particularly to ask the question, in the year of our Lord 2025, in a world where we like to think that we value democracy and I will say that Lord Norton here gave me a bit of a lecture on whether democracy technically means people voting or whether it means the representation of the people through whatever means that might happen. I felt like maybe that was splitting hairs at a point. I think mostly when we refer to democracy, we do mean voting. But what does it mean for the UK to still have part of its parliament not be elected? Should that continue to exist? Or, as has at least been being felt out over the last few years, should we get rid of it? It was really interesting to chat to everyone about this topic, because across the 4 people, oh, I did find them all, didn't we? Across each of the 4 members of the House of Lords we managed to speak to, we did get a real array of opinion on it. And it does kind of feel like one of those topics where it's a bit more possible to have that conversation, I think. It feels like a really important constitutional question. I think it's really interesting, some of the sort of rejoinders to criticisms of the House of Lords, which do stand up to sort of scrutiny, but also sort of common sense reflection, and some of the ones which feel well-intentioned maybe, but don't really feel like they hold as much water as you would like them to, for half of our parliament to be composed in the way that it currently is. So, for those of you that are catching up, as things stand, the UK's parliament is effectively made up of 2 parts. The House of Commons, which is sort of the bit with the MPs in it that you're used to seeing on television, people shouting at each other across the room, order, order, jeer, jeer. And there are 650 of those, each of whom represent a geographical spot within the UK. And how big those are geographically or small those are depends vaguely on population. They get resized every so often. But it's kind of similar to members of parliament in lots of other countries that have first past the post systems. My feeling is that it's very similar to the House of Representatives in the US, where there is like a congressional district which one representative represents. The House of Lords is a little bit more unique. Lord Norton, who I spoke to, again, very sort of learned and very, very lovely guy, was sort of quite keen to point out that the House of Lords isn't entirely unique as an appointed house, but it is fairly... But it is a little bit unique. Effectively, the UK's upper house, the House of Lords, is appointed rather than elected. And if you want to see the exact processes through which that happens, you can go back and watch the video. But one of the interesting quirks is that there are more of these unelected politicians involved in the governing of the UK than there are elected ones, which I do think places us in a really interesting spot. One of the things which comes up in the video is the fact that one thing I don't mention actually is that it's the only upper chamber, so kind of secondary House of Parliament or Congress or whatever it's called in any particular country in the world, that is bigger than the lower house. And it is also the second largest parliamentary chamber or legislative chamber in the world after the Chinese National People's Assembly. So yeah, at the moment, probably the most controversial ways that one can become a member of the House of Lords is that if you are a bishop within the Church of England, which is the established Church of England, it is the church of which someone was pointing out the other day that technically the king or the queen previously isn't technically the head of the Church of England. Jesus is. The king or queen is the supreme governor, I want to say is the phrase. But the Church of England is really woven into the British state in various ways. But at the same time, 26 bishops from the church get to sit in the House of Lords and vote on laws just by having that role. That's, broadly speaking, it's the 26 most senior bishops. So these top 5 are all archbishops. Justin Welby recently resigned in a child abuse covering up scandal, which maybe hints a little bit towards one of the many reasons that this is not a system that feels like it stands the water. I'm being too kind. No, it's ridiculous. Sorry, I'm trying to be really even-handed there. It is ludicrous that a particular, not even a particular religion, but a particular denomination of a particular religion gets representation in Parliament just for the sake of just as a result of existing. Usually it's the 26 most senior bishops, but there was a big backlog. I'm trying to think. I'm not sure how long there have been. The first female bishops of the Church of England were, I don't know what the phrase is for being promoted, but promoted in 2015. And that meant that effectively all of the most senior bishops were all men. So they've currently got a thing where they've decided that they're going to only promote women to the House of Lords until parity has been achieved. Which, looking at it, they're Simone's saying ordained? You get ordained as a priest, but do you get, like, double ordained to be a bishop? Do you get extra ordained? I don't know. The other way to become a member is by being appointed by the Prime Minister. Often is seen as the least controversial way through which people become members of the House of Lords. I think it is as controversial. It's more that the other two ways are particularly wild. The other way that you become a member is through inheriting a hereditary peerage. And this is one of the things that we talk about most in the video, is that there is currently a bit of a compromise in the House of Lords where up until 1999, there were just a whole load of people who were lords in the very old school sense of their great-great-great-great-granddad had done something really notable as it had been seen at the time, and then therefore the title had been passed down, and that person, and they were all men, I believe, because you couldn't inherit a peerage if you're a woman, got to sit in the House of Lords simply because their great-great-great-great-great-granddad did something interesting at the time. Some of them probably horrific things. I don't have a complete list of... In fact, my favourite part, actually, of making this video is we got to speak to the Earl of Devon. And chatting to the Earl of Devon was a lot of fun. I knew someone's sort of complex thoughts about getting rid of the hereditary peers. So, to clarify, these sort of 92... remaining hereditary peers. So there used to be hundreds of them. Back in 99, a compromise was struck that only 92 of them would remain. And the Labour government are currently passing legislation to be like, sorry lads, your time's up. It's been a good run, but maybe it's actually unconscionable to have people writing laws for us simply by birthright. And it was really interesting chatting to the other day because he was very much of the opinion, like, yeah, this is sort of bonkers, and I'm sort of glad to be here, and I've enjoyed my time and hope to have done some good with it, but I agree that it's maybe a bit silly. And that was a really interesting perspective, even from the perspective of, like, as a filmmaker or whatever, someone trying to make a video that's interesting. You know, there's a version where we spoke to someone who was just dead against it and was like, you'll pry this right from my cold dead hands. And so it was really interesting chatting to him. So I mentioned in the video, sort of, effectively, it's a video of two halves. Dun dun dun. The first half, we mostly talk about the removal of these hereditary peers, like the Earl of Devon, and the fact that they are currently looking like they're going to get booted out. The second half, we look slightly more at the fundamentals of the house itself. One of the big sort of suggestions that something will happen to the House of Lords has come from a document called A New Britain, Renewing Our Democracy and Rebuilding Our Economy, which is the result of a thing called the Brown Commission. Many of you will remember Gordon Brown, former Prime Minister of the UK, and I think sort of did a sort of fine job when he was in, and actually since leaving office has continued to kind of stick around doing broadly pro-social things, such as writing reports on the future of British democracy. So Gordon Brown was sort of sent away at the point where it was pretty certain that the Labour Party were going to win the 2024 election. He was sort of given the task by Keir Starmer of writing this report on various aspects of, like, how do we fix some of the fundamental problems in the UK, but kind of in a sort of broad framework sense rather than the nuts and bolts. So the report is sort of about where power sits in the country. You know, is the UK too centralised? Should the economy be spread out? Like, what are the problems in terms of economics and industry and that kind of stuff, and also constitutional matters. So rather than the kind of nuts and boltsy stuff, the broader stuff. One of the things that he really tuned in on was the House of Lords. And his recommendation, I mean, it's worth saying he wrote this with a sort of commission of people as well. That's not, you know, not to not give him the credit, but there was lots of other people who put time and effort into this. And it repeatedly refers to the House of Lords as indefensible, which is quite strong words. And his pitch has been that it should be replaced with a new second chamber of Parliament, an Assembly of the Nations and Regions. Someone suggested in the chat a little while ago that one option for replacing the House of Lords would be to have a sort of proportional house. And for a long time, that was one suggestion. There's been various suggestions which over the years have popped up as the most popular for a time. So during the video, I talk towards the end about some of these. And for a long time, the sort of big campaigner for reform of the House of Lords was Tony Benn, who was a left-wing Labour MP who happens to be a hereditary member of the House of Lords himself, but didn't take up that. In fact, he actively legislation had to be passed so that he could say, no, I don't want that role. And he sort of sacked that off, and he was a elected MP for many, many years, like until my lifetime. And his pitch was always just get rid of the House of Lords, just have a House of Commons, and they can just sit as a unicameral, so one chamber parliament. That's a thing that happens in quite a few countries in the world. And, we can argue whether it's better or worse than another model, but it clearly works in some regard. So, in the manifesto, the pitch was, there were sort of three things at different levels. The main one being hereditary peers remain indefensible, and because appointments are for life. So one of the other quirks of the House of Lords is that everyone who sits in it and gets appointed just gets to be there forever. Whether that's Lord Norton here, whether that's Baroness Smith, who got appointed at the age of 28 and gets to, and will now, unless anything changes, just be there forever. Well, until she, God, I don't want to wish death on her, sadly passes away. The sort of immediate modernisation that is currently happening, this is legislation which is being passed through Parliament as we speak, is that the remaining 92 hereditary peers are going to go. It was interesting speaking with the various members of the House of Lords that we spoke to. So, Baroness Smith here, 100% against it. For the removal of the hereditary peers. As someone who opposes the existence of the House of Lords in its entirety, she doesn't think it's sort of good enough, but she sort of backs the getting rid of the hereditary peers at the very least. The Earl of Devon, quite interestingly, sort of was like, yeah, I get it. Had some questions about, in a way similar to Baroness Smith, of going, if the hereditary peers aren't there and the only people in the House of Lords are appointed by the Prime Minister, that is probably, that is bad. I don't necessarily know that the argument, like his argument is sort of like that, or therefore there is something that is positive being removed in terms of the hereditary peers. I don't think it necessarily follows that we should keep the hereditary peers because of that, but so in the end, his argument sort of ends up being that we should go further as well. Both Lord Norton had a sort of similar-ish take, that getting rid of the hereditary peers without having some other independent way through which people can sit in the House of Lords has its problems and puts a lot of power on the Prime Minister. Baroness Brown actually suggested that a lot of the hereditary peers should be given life peerages because she sort of thought some of them were just like good legislators. So it was an interesting kind of range of opinions on it. I sort of assumed that appointed members of the House of Lords would be like, yeah, I agree that this is wild, and therefore they should go. And it actually wasn't that simple. And some of that, I think, on a few of the different topics, I think there was a tendency for members of the House of Lords that we were speaking to who saw real positives in its function. There was sort of a tendency to view those positive short-term things and to not take the step back to go, actually, the system that allows, there might be some positives through if you squint a bit, of having hereditary peers in there because they're not, they've not been appointed by the Prime Minister, they're not buffeted by elections, etc., and popular opinion. Like, you can read a sort of positive into that, but does that mean that the broader structure and system through which enables that is good? Like, does that mean that an alternative to that is automatically not good? Another aspect was the idea of a mandatory retirement age. So one problem the House of Lords has, which, again, I mentioned in the video later on, I think, is that because people sit in it for life, the median age of it is just really old. It currently has a median age of 71, which is not double the median age of the UK, but 30 years older, which is a lot. And if you have lifetime appointments, it's hard to do anything about that. So one of their ideas was, okay, what if when a member reaches the age of 80, they're automatically retired and have to leave, which would help to cut down on the number of members. It would stop a system where, much like we've seen in the US Senate, actually, you have people who are like 90 going through to vote on stuff. Which isn't to say that 90-year-olds can't have opinions on politics, but when the median age ends up being so high, it does become a bit of a sort of ballast on change. This hasn't been put through yet, I will say. Yeah, first name bunch of numbers says they should be retired after a certain number of terms at least. This was actually a point that Baroness Smith made, which it didn't make it into the video, but was something she mentioned in our conversation. She sort of said, actually a hard age cutoff is potentially, that feels discriminatory in a way that maybe we're right to want to question. And she did actually sort of suggest, what if there's even if we kept a system of appointments, you get appointed for a certain amount of time, and therefore someone could be appointed at 75 and serve until they're 85, if it was felt that, that was appropriate, rather than having a hard cutoff. There's some suggestion about improving how people are appointed to ensure that good and proper people are appointed. Those of you that will have watched the video will know that sort of Boris Johnson's time as Prime Minister was notorious for questionable appointments, let's say, to the House of Lords. He appointed a lot of members of the House of Lords. And also the quality of person sounds awful. That's not the phrase I'm looking for. The sort of reputations and experience of people that he was appointing were kind of questionable as well. Talking in the video about Evgeny Lebedev is one of his friends who's one of his friends who's the son of a guy called Alexander Lebedev, who was a KGB agent who spied on the UK, and is now on like sanctions lists. Like various people who just like he was criticized for appointing. And one of the challenges with that is that there is a body called the House of Lords Appointments Commission, the job of which is broadly to sort of vet people who are going to be put into the House of Lords. It also can suggest people itself, but that happens very rarely. But because all of its recommendations are advisory, basically the Prime Minister can just go like, meh, no thank you. And Boris Johnson did that specifically with this guy, Pat McFadden, as well. So there seems to be some suggestion that the Labour Party want to reform some of that sort of stuff. That's sort of a bit more complicated. I think it's less a case of having to get stuff passed that becomes difficult there. It's more a case of like, exactly what do you do and how does that work? At which point, do you just replace the whole thing? And again, this is something, this is in the 2024 Labour Manifesto. The words which are in there are, whilst this action to modernise the House of Lords will be an improvement, Labour is committed to replacing the House of Lords with an alternative second chamber that is more representative of the regions and nations. Labour will consult on proposals seeking the input of the British public on how politics can best serve them. Which I think is I genuinely think is a really good idea to go, do you know what? Let's have a big discussion about how this should work. As I mentioned in the video, the House of Lords is like deeply unpopular. And that's not me, that's not me saying that just to be mean. 16% of people support the House of Lords remaining as it is now. 61% actively oppose it. That is wild in polling. That's beyond conclusive. So I think that, there's an interesting opportunity to go, actually, can we try and have a big conversation about how we want our politics to work and what we want in the place of a second chamber?